Fondation Jean-Jaurès.
Penser pour agir.
Violent extremism, whether ideological, political, or religious, has been a major source of concern in international politics. In the Western Balkans, it has gained ground in recent years and caused heightened tensions within societies. Against the backdrop of rising insecurity, violent extremism has become a factor brandished by some to oppose the further enlargement of the EU. It certainly is a fear that thrives in France. To diffuse it, or at least to talk about it, I received today Lura Pollozhani. Lura, you are a researcher at the Center for Southeastern European Studies at the University of Graz. You are co-founder of Stella in North Macedonia, former advisor to North Macedonian's Prime Minister. I am Florent, director of the Observatory des Balkans at the Fondation Jean-Jaurès. Lura, good morning.
Good morning, Florent.
you are participating in a large EU research project on preventing and countering violent extremism in MENA, in Middle East and North Africa, and in the Western Balkans, or in Balkans. You just published your first report. What is the extent of the threat posed by violent extremism to the political and societal stability in the Western Balkans?
As you said, this project is quite large, and it involves the investigation of the context within which violent extremism and radicalization can arise in these two regions. Since your introduction was more about the Balkans, I'll focus more on the findings from the Balkans. But just to give some background, we've already done the research on the macro level and the meso level drivers of radicalization. And this project specifically focuses on 7 drivers, and I think it's important to mention at the outset because most of our findings are then filtered through these drivers. So first we have religion, then we have digitalization, economic deprivation, territorial inequalities, transnational dynamics, sociopolitical demands or grievances, and educational, cultural, and leisure opportunities. You mentioned at the outset the heightened insecurity. And we see in the Balkans especially that this feeling of instability, insecurity, political grievance is actually quite a significant driver when it comes to radicalization and violent extremism. And it's important to note here that we're not just talking about Islamist radicalization, which is usually referred to, but we see, especially in the case of Bulgaria, the rise of the far-right radicalization and violent extremism. And we also see it in the kind of display of football fan clubs, also in the other countries in the Balkans, like Bosnia and Herzegovina and North Macedonia. So what the findings so far have shown is really that the context really matters in how especially young people choose to kind of find their agency, right? We found, for example, in the case of Bosnia, that this feeling, there is very much a lack of agency or a feeling of injustice because of high levels of unemployment, of political uncertainty. So the frame of unjust systems is really heightened, and this pushes young people especially to look for different answers and to look for different narratives or to find a new sense of belonging in countries where, you know, this is not so easily given. And lastly, especially in the Western Balkans, this tension is then also heightened when you also equate it to the fact that, especially in the cases of Islamist radicalization, this also is connected to interethnic relations and also interethnic conflict. For example, in the case of Roma in Bulgaria, they're particularly targeted as a hub of Islamist radicalization. Also, although in Bulgaria you haven't had that many cases, for example, of foreign fighters, but it's almost a kind of a strategy of targeting an already marginalized group. So in this sense, in the context of the Western Balkans, it invites us to be even more careful when we investigate these things, these phenomena, because they're not only tied to, let's say, objective and legalistic or technical terms. They're very much also burdened by the local context and also the marginalized groups in these countries, which makes it then even harder to investigate.
Thank you. So you mentioned, it's interesting, you already draw a little bit the picture. You mentioned some kind of violent extremism we might actually tend to oversee, so the ones which is not religious, you mentioned. You also mentioned the fact that sometimes we overestimate maybe some of the contents. But is it possible to assess in recent years the scale or the extent of this issue? Is it something which is relatively stable, regardless of how the proportion of religious and non-religious or violent extremism is or changes? Or is it something which is gaining grounds? This is the first question. The second one, how does it affect then the political environment, the political dynamics? Is there an automatic link between this core violent extremism, how it trickles down and contaminates, if you want, the political discourses?
So the question about scale and also about political connections, let's say, really are closely tied, especially if we look at far-right extremism. And the problem with far-right radicalization and also ideologies is how they get mainstreamed into the political debates. And therefore, they're less addressed then by policies. So for example, all of the countries of the Western Balkans have some sort of strategy against Islamist radicalization, but none of these countries really take the issue of far-right extremism seriously. And that's because it's usually normalized. And in the sense of it being normalized, then it really very much forms part of governing structures. For example, we've seen this in Bulgaria, where far-right narratives, ideologies have even made it to the government in specific points in time, in recent times, which has also affected the debate, particularly when it comes to hate speech oftentimes, and also derogatory speech against marginalized groups, whether these be ethnic, racial, or sexual marginalized groups. In terms of the scale and how serious it is, the answer is less clear, in the sense that a lot of what happens with radicalization and violent extremism is not often happening on the level of society where it's so open and so visible, right? That is one of the concerns, and that's why very often the approaches to these phenomena are oftentimes very securitized, because they're seen to happen behind some veil or some closed rooms or mosques in some cases, or stadium in the open cases. So in this sense, it's harder to say exactly what the scale is, but one thing is for sure is that with the digitalization of methods of spreading violent extremist and radicalized ideas, we see that there is more spread of fake news, there is more spread of conspiracy theories, and all of these influence public policy making. We saw this with COVID and the anti-vaccination movements. All of these news were shared on many, as we have found with the meso-level research, they were shared continuously on these far-right or conservative, let's say, groups. And I think this does influence politics, because then it is either in terms of rejecting policies that affect these conspiracy theories, or rejecting political parties just because they don't consider, these conspiracies or take them seriously.
Now, if we shift on the drivers of violent extremism, more specifically in the Balkans, what are the most significant you have found? What are these roots and these drivers which really matter among the lists you have already mentioned?
Yeah, so religion is a driver. We cannot deny that, especially when it comes to Islamist radicalization. But also religion in terms of Christian groups, namely a lot of far-right groups and protest groups that have caused, for example, in North Macedonia with the storming of the parliament, some of these groups were Christian groups, Christian Orthodox groups of Christian Orthodoxy trying to protect the nation. So in this sense, religion in both cases of far-right and Islamist radicalization are important. Then is the issue of digitalization. And if you take into account also the lack of digital literacy that has been shown in other studies, especially in the case of North Macedonia, you consider how, let's say, dangerous or at least kind of cause for alarm this is. And we also see that economic deprivation and political grievances also form an important driver, particularly when we talk about the context where these happens. Why they might not be a very direct cause, but a context of unemployment, lack of opportunities, lack of spaces, political or civic spaces, really drive this sense of injustice and inequality. And lastly, transnational dynamics, especially in kind of these groups connecting to global narratives and global groups, is also quite important. And also, for example, the post-2001, 9/11 narratives, which kind of built this narrative of Islamist radicalization and violent extremism, has also been important in the local context. So although, you know, it happened somewhere else, these narratives have been transferred in the local context to create narratives of victimization, which actually drive even more the sense of injustice and drive youth towards radicalization.
So radicalization is like an offspring of a very complex constellation of predicaments. Have you come to certain policy recommendations on how to address this very complex constellation of issues?
While I would be a bit reluctant to give too many recommendations, considering that we still haven't done the micro level research, but what is apparent so far is the need for a broader approach to tackling violent extremism and radicalization, namely in our macro level, so institutional approach studies. It was very evident that most institutional approaches are very securitized and very top-down, and also very centered on targeted specific groups, which has also served to further marginalize them and further draw them in a different field, let's say. So adopting an approach that tackles this sense of insecurity, especially among young people, is key. Here, the educational institutions particularly are very significant. For example, to just show a case from the MENA findings, at one point schools were even considered as sort of incubators of radicalization, not in terms of teaching radicalization, but because youth felt so unseen, let's say. So tackling programs that address the public and civic spaces of young people is very important. Also creating spaces, for example, free spaces where you don't have to pay for coffee or where you don't have to pay for services, but just open spaces where young people can do activities and get interested in kind of joining different clubs, civic clubs, would also help. So educational and leisure opportunities, I think, are very important. And lastly, also, this is again, something that always is missing is the gender component. So it's also very important to look especially at spaces that are also safe for women, young women, also young mothers or mothers who find it hard to perhaps re-enter society after they've been part of these more radical groups, but also safe spaces for them to be able to look for new solutions to their grievances. So I think these are some things that are already evident with our findings.
Thank you very much, Lura. It's extremely interesting. Thank you for sharing this broader perspective on this complex issue. And thank you. Goodbye.
I'm glad. Goodbye.
Fondation Jean-Jaurès.
Penser pour agir.